Fighter jets bombed the presidential palace of Chile, with the president still inside. His name was Salvador Allende, and he had been elected. The palace was called La Moneda. The date was September 11th, 1973. 28 years before New York, this was the other September 11th. The jets were Chilean, the pilots were Chilean, but the 3 years that led to that morning were made in Washington, because the United States did not fire those rockets. It had spent 3 years making sure someone would, and on tape, afterward, a president of the United States said 5 quiet words about it. Our hand doesn't show on this one. To understand it, you have to start with an election. On the 4th of September 1970, Chile did something no country had done before. It freely elected a Marxist president. Salvador Allende, a doctor and a socialist, won at the head of a coalition called Unidad Popular, Popular Unity. He was the first Marxist ever to win a presidential election anywhere in the Americas by a free vote. It wasn't a landslide. He won a plurality, about 36%, and Chile's Congress confirmed him 7 weeks later. Allende promised a path no one thought possible. Socialism, nationalised copper, land handed to the poor, milk for every child, but reach through the ballot box, not a revolution. A peaceful, democratic path to socialism, in a country with a functioning democracy. He nationalised the copper mines that had been owned by American companies for decades. He broke up the great estates and handed the land to the peasants who worked it. For the first time, the poorest people in Chile felt the state was on their side. To millions of Chileans, he was proof it could be done. To Washington, he was a nightmare. A Marxist, elected in America's own hemisphere, and worse, one who might succeed. Because a communist who took power by force could be called a tyrant. But a socialist who won a clean election and made it work was a far more dangerous thing. He was an example. In Washington, one man took it personally. Richard Nixon was enraged. 11 days after the election, he called his CIA director, Richard Helms, into the Oval Office. It was the afternoon of September the 15th, 1970. Helms took notes by hand. Those notes survived, and they are one of the most damning documents of the Cold War. Nixon wanted Allende stopped, and Helms wrote down the order, "Make the economy scream." There was money on the table, $10 million, the note says, available, more if necessary. Best men we have, full-time job, 48 hours for a plan. Think about what those words actually are. President of the United States, ordering his spy agency to wreck the economy of a democracy, on purpose, to punish it for an election it had held. Not a war, not a threat to America, an election with the wrong result. The plan came in 2 tracks, but track 1 was strangulation, an invisible blockade choking Chile's credit and loans, while American money poured into Allende's opponents. That money bought a newspaper. The CIA funneled cash to El Mercurio, Chile's biggest paper, to run day after day of black propaganda against the president. It bankrolled strikes, truckers, shopkeepers, to freeze the country and empty the shelves. A nationwide truckers' strike, quietly helped along, brought the flow of goods across Chile to a standstill. And an American corporation offered to help. The telephone giant ITT, which owned most of Chile's phone system, offered money to Washington to keep Allende from ever taking office. But track 1 was the patient plan. Track 2 was the knife. Track 2 had a deadline. The CIA wanted a military coup before he could even take office, while there was still time to stop him. But Chile's army wouldn't move, and the reason was one man. General René Schneider was the commander of Chile's army, and he lived by a simple rule: soldiers do not overthrow governments. As long as he stood at the top of that army, there would be no coup. So the CIA judged him a stumbling block and set out to remove him. Under a plan code named FUBEL-T, the agency slipped untraceable weapons and cash to Chilean officers plotting to kidnap him. The idea was to snatch Schneider, blame the left, and panic the army into seizing power. This is the moment the American hand is easiest to see. Not the coup of 1973. This, 3 years earlier, guns and money passed to men who were about to grab a general off the street. On the morning of October 22nd, 1970, they ambushed his car in Santiago. Schneider reached for his own weapon and they shot him at point-blank range. He died 3 days later. And it backfired completely. A country sickened by the murder of its own general rallied around Allende, and the day after Schneider was shot, Congress confirmed the president the plot was meant to stop. The knife had slipped, so Washington went back to the patient plan and waited. For nearly 3 years, the invisible blockade did its work. The CIA spent around $8 million bankrolling Allende's enemies. The press, the parties, the strikers. Chile began to tear itself apart. Shelves emptied, prices soared, trucks stopped rolling. Housewives marched through Santiago beating on empty pots, and the streets filled with people who wanted Allende gone. Some of it was Allende's own doing. His economy was in trouble on its own, but Washington was pouring petrol on every fire it could find. The strategy was simple and cruel. Make life miserable enough for long enough that ordinary Chileans would beg the army to step in and end the chaos. Manufacture the crisis, then let the generals present themselves as the cure. And this is the part the myth gets wrong. The United States did not plan the coup that finally came. It spent 3 years breaking a country, and then handed the wreckage to men who would do the rest. By 1973, the army had a new commander, a General Allende himself had promoted, believing he was loyal. His name was Augusto Pinochet. Allende had put the man who would destroy him in charge of his own army, and in the first days of September, the general stopped waiting. At 6 in the morning on September 11th, 1973, the coup began. The Navy seized the ports. The army took the streets. Pinochet led 4 commanders who now called themselves a junta. He rushed to the palace and refused to run. They offered him a plane out of the country. He said no. Instead, he went on the radio one last time. On a single station still broadcasting, Radio Magallanes, the president spoke to his people while the soldiers closed in. "These are my last words," he told them. "Sooner rather than later, the great avenues will open again, where free people will walk to build a better society. Long live Chile, long live the people, long live the workers." Then the jets came. At 2 minutes before noon, 2 Hawker Hunter fighter jets rolled in over the centre of Santiago and rocketed the presidential palace in 5 screaming passes. La Moneda, the seat of Chilean democracy, burst into flames with the president still inside. As troops stormed the burning palace, Salvador Allende took an assault rifle, a gift from Fidel Castro, and shot himself rather than surrender. For decades, the Chilean left believed he was executed, but a court-ordered exhumation in 2011, examined by an international forensic team, settled it beyond doubt he died by his own hand. The president chose to die in his palace rather than be led out of it. Only 2 men died inside La Moneda that day, Allende and a journalist who stayed with him to the end. By nightfall, Allende was dead, and Chile belonged to the generals. The most stable democracy in South America had ended in a single morning. What came next was not a coup, it was a hunt. They turned Santiago's National Stadium into a mass prison. Tens of thousands of Chileans were herded onto its terraces, interrogated, tortured, and some of them executed where the crowds had once watched football. When the junta finally let cameras inside, the images went around the world, rows of frightened prisoners under the guns of their own army. Then an army death squad took to the air. A caravan of death, a squad acting on Pinochet's orders, flew from town to town by helicopter, dragging prisoners from their cells and killing them. By the official reckoning, around 3,000 Chileans were killed or disappeared, and tens of thousands more were tortured or imprisoned. And in Washington, the reaction was relief. On tape, Kissinger complained the world didn't recognise the American role, and Nixon reassured him, "Our hand doesn't show on this one." Augusto Pinochet ruled Chile for 17 years. The United States recognised his junta and kept the relationship flowing. And here is the fact that survived every denial. The head of Pinochet's secret police, Manuel Contreras, the man who ran the torture and Operation Condor, The network that hunted exiles across borders was, in the mid-1970s, a paid asset of the CIA. His agents detonated a car bomb on a street in Washington, D.C., killing a former Chilean ambassador and an American woman beside him. The full record of what Washington had done stayed classified for a generation until the year 2000. When the files were finally opened, tens of thousands of pages, they confirmed in the government's own words what Chile had believed all along. No one in Washington was ever punished for any of it. The hunter grew old, the dead stayed dead, and the paperwork sat in a vault. The man who ordered, "Make the economy scream," was never charged. Nixon died in his bed, a former president. Henry Kissinger, who chaired the committee that ran the secret war on Chile, died free in 2023, aged 100, a Nobel Peace Laureate. The Nobel Prize had been announced barely 5 weeks after the coup. The United States did not carry out the coup. It did something quieter, and in its own way, worse. It spent 3 years breaking a democracy on purpose, watched the wreckage fall, and then shook hands with the men standing on top of it. Salvador Allende died in his burning palace on the 11th of September. The other one, the one nobody remembers,